Welcome. Hi, my name is Arlene Cantor. I'm a professor here at the College of Law, director of our Disability Law and Policy program, which this year is commemorating its 10th year in existence. And the Disability Law Policy program, yes, we can applaud, Michael, that's okay. The Disability Law and Policy program was really founded as a way to coordinate our disability law initiatives, and even more importantly, to coordinate with other units, colleges, and departments across campus. This is the fifth and final lecture as part of our series, and I have to say Sue Swenson was originally invited to be our first and inaugural speaker in our series, and unfortunately she couldn't make it then, but we're so glad that she's here now. So really thank you for coming. This program, this lecture series, and the Disability Law Policy program would really have little meaning if it wasn't in cooperation with other units, colleges, and departments across campus. We all know that disability is an interdisciplinary field, and we all want to learn, grow, challenge each other from our respective fields. And that's what goes on here at Syracuse University. So I'd be remiss if I didn't first start by thanking all of my very dear colleagues, students, faculty, programs, departments, and initiatives throughout the university that have helped co-sponsor this 5-part lecture series. I want to thank specifically, the School of Education, the Cultural Foundations Education Program within the School of Ed, Falk College, and the faculty and students there. I'd like to thank the Dean of Arts and Sciences, who as well has contributed, the Honors Program, the Disability Cultural Center, which, by the way, I think is one of the first of its kind that works to advocate for pride and disability identity. The Disability Law Society, yay, call out Disability Law Society. The Beyond Compliance Coordinating Committee. The Office of Inclusion and Resolution Services. I still got it wrong, third time in a row. Aaron Hadukovich, our new ADA coordinator, and his office. I'm probably forgetting someone. Chris Ramsdell and Lynn Oatman, our support staff, who, again, without whom we can't do anything here. Our dean's office, which has been very supportive of our series. Who am I missing, Catherine? And Joe Whitney, of course, our brilliant tech person and the arranger of everything audio and visual. I also want to thank our sign language interpreters, Michael and Michelle, who are here with us today, again, without whom we could not be communicating together. And back behind me, the anonymous CART interpreter back there, who is allowing us all to read as well as listen to the presentations today. I think I've thanked everyone, but more importantly from my heart, I really want to thank all of you for being here today. It's been an amazing series. I know I have learned personally so much. My students have reported to me that they've learned, and having Sue Swenson today as the ultimate final speaker in the series really is the cherry on top. So I don't know if that's a great analogy, Sue, but we're really happy you're here. I'm going to take a minute to introduce Sue. Then she's going to speak to us about inclusive education and her thoughts and experiences, of which there are many. We've allowed some time at the end for questions, and I hope there'll be an active dialogue about many of the issues that Sue raises. And when you do speak and ask questions, be sure to turn on the microphone so our CART reporter can record what's being said. Okay? So sit tight. Here we go. Sue Swenson is currently the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitation Services at the U.S. Department of Education. She's held that since 2010, and I learned today that as of May 1st, she's been promoted to Assistant Secretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. So we have now with us the new Assistant Secretary of Education. Currently, Sue serves as a deputy advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Education on matters related to education of children and youth with disabilities, as well as employment and community living for youth and adults with disabilities. The mission of her office is to provide leadership to achieve full integration and participation in society of all people with disabilities by promoting inclusion, ensuring equity, and creating opportunities for children and adults with disabilities. In addition to serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary, she's also served as the Director of OSER's National Institute for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, and she served in previous administrations as the Commissioner for Developmental Disabilities in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Prior to that, as many of us, I think this is when I originally met her, she was the CEO of the ARC of the United States, and prior to that, she was the director of the Joseph Kennedy Foundation. She has lived and worked in the field of disability rights for many years. Part of it was her original experience, which she'll share with us, developing as a disability advocate on behalf of her middle son, Charlie, who had disabilities. She was active there when he was growing up in the Minneapolis schools, as well as in state and federal arenas to work on policy, and in marketing, I found out, in the environmental field even before that. She was educated at the University of Chicago, earned her AM there, as well as an MBA from the University of Minnesota. Please join me in welcoming Sue. Thank you.
I never quite recognize myself, but I do have one main principle, which is never believe your own PR. So I will be stepping up again to be the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, and I'm really looking forward to that. It's good to be king. It's good to have people organize around you and bring everything to you and bring all the decisions to you. I think it's always interesting to do that coming from the parent movement. And so I learned from Mrs. Shriver when I was working for her to always ask the question, how will this work for this kid? How will this work for this family? Don't tell me about the trail of regulations. Tell me about how it's going to work for people. I think that is the interesting question. Today, I want to tell you some stories as well as try to provoke some thinking. I have some oddball ideas about what we should be doing in special education, and what I want to do is leave the challenge with you to take those and either kick them to the side of the road or fix them up or whatever else needs to be done. I'm a political appointee, so I leave at the end of the Obama administration. I don't know how much you know about how these appointments work, but we come in and then we're gone. And sometimes the people who run the administration when we're not there think of us as the summer help. We're typically there for 6 or 7 or 8 years at a time, and then the new administration will bring someone else in. I just want to leave one idea with you, though, because I think it's popular in the United States to think that our government is somehow at fault. I believe in the core of my being, and as the parent of a man who had multiple disabilities, I believe that the U.S. federal bureaucracy is a flower of civilization. There are nations around the world that would give anything to have a bureaucracy that when their legislators would put money into a program, they would be sure that the money would be spent exactly the way it's supposed to be spent. And that's what you get from our federal bureaucracy. Thank you, sir. It's something we don't say enough, and we always talk about, well, let's blame the feds for this or that or the other thing. The people I know who work in my office, when I gave this little talk to them, some of them were in tears because all they do is read in the newspaper how we need to get rid of the Department of Ed or how we need to get rid of the feds or the feds are the problem. Travel to Russia and ask them what they would think about having a bureaucracy that worked like ours. Travel in South America, travel in Europe, frankly. And part of it is the way the democracy is set up with the 3 branches. You know, you go to England, whoever is prime minister also controls the ministers of all the agencies. So there's much less argument and separation, and I think less innovation and less progress because of that. So I would just encourage you to think about this a little bit. The federal bureaucracy is not that old. It's newer than our government is, and it was considered at the time of its construction to be a new way of thinking about things. And I do think it, as difficult as it is to drive the nation in new directions from a bureaucratic post, it is still possible, and we still have a lot to do. So since I'm in the academy, I want to tell you my favorite Socrates story. When Plato was writing the dialogues, he had Socrates out in the woods. That's what the academy meant, the forest, sitting and talking to ordinary people about ordinary things. People who were involved in military or in just dealing with family struggles or dealing with their own government or and people made fun of Plato and they made fun of Socrates because what they said was, the really important work in the academy is not being done out here sitting around with ordinary, regular people. The really important work is being done back behind the closed doors, where we, members of the academy, speak to each other, where we are experts in all of these various things, and we have dialogues and conversations with each other, and that's where the real work happens. That's where the real intellectual work happens. I just want to point out to you that we're still reading about Socrates now, and nobody knows what those people were talking about behind the closed doors. Whatever it was, it's gone, it's disappeared. So I would urge you to think about how important it is to work on the ordinary problems of ordinary citizens within university settings, and how that is, in fact, what will help us move forward and will help us carry, frankly, even some of Plato's ideas forward and leave some of them behind because we have thought of better ideas. So Kant said the same thing in The Conflict of the Faculties, the one book by Kant that nobody reads. So I get to quote it because nobody's read it. What he says is, when you look at the faculties of a university, it's the ones that are closest to the people and their problems that are the most important. This is not generally the way that American universities are funded or thought about. Typically, it's the guys with the white coats and the NIH grants, and the guys who are working on cell structures or physics or some of the other things that are far removed from the problems of the ordinary citizen. Those are the people who are given the highest regard. They're thought of as being the real scientists, the important scientists. But today, while we're here in this room, I want to tell you that I think you're the real scientists. You're the people who are working on how do we educate children? What could possibly be more important? How do we educate people to work in all of the fields that we want them to work in? What could possibly be more important? How do we work with legal problems that create our culture and help us interact with each other? This is incredibly important work. In disability, we don't see a lot of research funding in the legal field. We don't see anywhere near as much in education as I wish we did. And we don't have a lot of advocacy for research funding in these fields. I always thought when I was at Developmental Disabilities that there should be 5 university centers on developmental disabilities in law schools. And I still think that, and I still can't find anybody else to go knock on the doors in Congress and say, by the way, we would like $500,000 to fund our disability law center. I just read this morning that Leeds has started a new hub in disability law, and very interdisciplinary and very interesting. Well, we should be doing that here, and it should be connected. And 5, I just picked that out of the sky. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 7, I don't know. But I do think it would be an important advance to begin thinking about how do we structure legal research that's driven by public policy needs in disability, rather than driven only by the academic interest of the people. Anyway, just a thought. I have another story for you. And this one, so I was noodling around one weekend looking at the Monticello website. And I realized that Jefferson's diaries are there. And you can find them if you go look at monticello.org. And so I remembered that Tom Gilhool, who brought the Park case, had told me once that Jefferson had a disabled sister, and I thought, let's see what I can find out about that. Well, what I found out about it was that his sister Elizabeth was 2 years younger than he was. She was his closest sibling. They were very close personally as well as in age. When his mother died, they all lived together at Monticello. When Jefferson's mother died, he wrote to other politicians in the newly forming nation and said, I can no longer work on any politics. I am now responsible to care for my sister Elizabeth. In 1774, there was an earthquake at Monticello, followed by a hurricane, basically. And Elizabeth was described by neighbors as being, quote, an imbecile, which probably meant that she had a couple of words and could walk but couldn't care for herself. When there was this hurricane and earthquake, she became so agitated that she ran from the house. So I'm thinking, yeah, a little anxiety disorder or a little autism, what we would call autism, mixed in there. People have said that Jefferson probably had Asperger's syndrome. So anyway, she ran from the house and they found her body 2 weeks later in a river with her maid. She had died and her maid had died. This was 1774, at which point Jefferson wrote and said, I am now willing to re-engage in the political process that you are all involved in. And some 2 years later, he wrote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all people are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You know these words by heart. And there have been many arguments over the years that Jefferson just meant that white male landowners were all equal. But having been the family member of a person with significant disabilities, that is not something that you put aside. It is something that informs all of your thoughts and everything you know about how the world works and what's important. So I think when he wrote, all people are created equal, he meant us too. He meant the people that we care about, people with disabilities. His sister had very significant disabilities. And by the way, there were asylums at that time in Virginia, and the family must have chosen not to send Elizabeth to an asylum. Patrick Henry had a wife who also wasn't sent to an asylum when she had what was probably Alzheimer's, early Alzheimer's. She died very soon after getting her mental illness. But anyway, the notion that there were people, founders involved in our nation who put in place ideas. I mean, to what extent does we hold these truths to be self-evident inform everything else? To what extent does it inform the 14th Amendment, which becomes the basis of most of the work that we do? I think to a tremendous extent. You're talking about anniversaries, so I want to also point this out. Jefferson wrote those words in 1776. 40 years later, he wrote these words. They are on the they're carved on the wall of the Jefferson Memorial. I was there last year on his birthday, which was a few days ago, April 13th. He wrote these 40 years after he wrote the Declaration. I'm certainly not an advocate for frequent and untried changes in laws and constitutions. Laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths disclosed, and manners and opinions change with the change of circumstances, institutions must advance also and keep pace with the times. We might as well require a man to wear still the coat which fitted him when he was a boy, as ask civilized society to remain ever under the regimen of their barbarous ancestors. This is the 40th year of IDEA. So it's our 40th anniversary this year, and I think it's time for us to challenge our barbarous ancestors. Our barbarous ancestors, when they wrote the special education law, special education was a place that you went to, and it was abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Children who were, quote, in special education did not have the hope of getting a diploma. They did not have the hope, in most places, of being a citizen. Once you were in special ed, you weren't going to vote, you weren't going to marry, you weren't going to graduate. So, the idea in 1975 of building due process in right at the front end of special education perhaps made sense because there was a taking there. When you put kids in special education, you were taking away their rights. 40 years later, opinions have changed, manners and ideas have changed. We have become more enlightened. A child with a disability educated under IDEA no longer has to abandon all hope of getting a diploma. Our goal is to make sure kids can meet those requirements and get a diploma. Not a fake diploma, a real diploma. They don't have to abandon the hope of voting because people with disabilities have the right to vote. They don't have to abandon the idea of directing their own lives because we know and understand much more about self-determination, supported decision-making, all of the other pieces than we used to know. So I'm wondering if maybe it's time for us to say we're not going to require due process on the front end. Maybe we'll only require due process if, like under EEOC, the person can say, this hasn't worked, I haven't been given my rights, and now I want to engage due process. Now, there's a whole bunch of rooms I can't say this in. There's a whole bunch of people who, the whole point. And when I used to train parents, I used to say, you guys are willing to fall on your sword, and you think that you have the most important right in the world, which is the right to due process. That's just the right to sue the school. What about your child's right to an inclusive education? I think there's almost a clash between due process and the right to full participation at this point. And I'm going to tell you some stories that will maybe give you an idea about why I might be right or wrong about this. When my Charlie was little, Charlie never walked or talked in his entire life. He had two brothers, one older and one younger. He was big and in some ways strong, but in other ways very weak. He had muscular dystrophy. He couldn't stand up. He couldn't hold his head up for a long time when he was a baby. When he finally did start school, first he had a center-based program because Minnesota wasn't signed on yet with Part H. Then when he went to a school, it was a segregated school on the other side of town from where we lived in Minneapolis, 45 minutes from my house. Charlie always had one thing going for him, though. He had this beautiful little smile. He had this puff of dandelion blonde hair and a very beautiful smile. And after a couple of weeks in school, he started coming home and he started smiling. He sort of made this funny face and closed one eye and pulled his mouth over to one side. And I thought, gosh, his muscles must be deteriorating. Something bad is happening. I better go to school and see what's happening there. Maybe I can figure something out. So I went to school to observe, and Charlie and this other little guy were in prone standers next to each other on the side of the classroom. This was a classroom for children with severe disabilities within a school for children with disabilities, right? And the other little guy, when he smiled, went like this. So I said to the teacher, if Charlie is learning to do that from this other kid, then why don't we have Charlie in the classroom where he can learn the stuff that we want him to learn? And she said, oh my God, you're going to get me in so much trouble. Because they had had a due process filed the year before. She handed me a poorly copied application to Partners in Policymaking. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's a training program for parents and people with disabilities to learn together. And I filled it out and I got into the next year's class. By that time, though, I already had Charlie in the segregated classroom in our neighborhood school, which was just 2 blocks from my house. By that time, he was, I think, in 2nd grade. And I went to the 2nd grade teacher down the hall, who Will had had for 2nd grade, and I said, Joan, do me a favor. Can Charlie please come and have 5 minutes of inclusion after lunch in your classroom? Because I knew they had story time after lunch, and I thought Charlie could probably manage that. She said, yes, okay, that would be fine, because it's right down the hall from the special room, and they could just take him back afterwards. And after 2 weeks, she called me one day at work and said, Sue, it's Joan. I'm sorry, I really have to ask you a favor. The kids don't want him to go back to that little room. They think it's sad. Could he stay with us for the afternoon? And I said, well, Joan, as a special favor to you, he can stay for the afternoon. And then a couple weeks later, she said, this is silly. We do stuff in the morning that the kids think he would like, and we would like him to be with us all day. Would that be okay? Yes, fine. And with the support of the special ed staff in the school, he became part of the regular 2nd grade class. At the end of the year, she surveyed the children to ask them about their attitudes about disability, because she was expecting to see a change. They couldn't think of anybody they knew who had a disability. They just didn't see Charlie's disability anymore. Big wheelchair, nonverbal, autistic behaviors. They just didn't compute that as a disability. Now, I think that's astonishing. She also said to me, she said, Sue, have you ever been in a room with 30 2nd graders? I couldn't tell the difference between him and everybody else. They're all just bouncing off the walls. So it's interesting. She also told me it was her best year teaching. That was a common theme for Charlie as he went through school. This was my best year teaching. And this is really hard for me to talk about. I think that every teacher who had Charlie had their best year teaching because Charlie held down the bottom of the class in a very humane way. Children can be ruthless with each other. They can be mean and evil. And if they think the goal is to figure out who's the smartest and what is the hierarchy, then they will do that. And it can be not a pretty sight. But if they think the goal is to include everybody and figure out a way to do that, no matter if you stuttered or had a lisp or couldn't read, you could always help Charlie. And he didn't make fun of you and he didn't laugh at you. He was always happy to have the interaction. So I think there's a social purpose for inclusion in classrooms that goes far beyond what we might be measuring as the academic outcomes for kids, and something that we desperately need in schools, to teach every child that they belong, right? So the boys' elementary school in Minneapolis at that time, there was no racial majority. And their school was trilingual. It was English, Hmong, and Vietnamese. And to be able to teach kids who were recent immigrants and refugees that they belonged was part of what Charlie brought to the classroom as well. I think that matters. It mattered to Charlie because throughout his life, being included helped him learn how and when he could trust other people. And that he could trust other people. In his lifetime, he was always dependent on other people. It there was a vulnerability that I could not possibly have engineered enough oversight as a mother to really convince me that he was safe. Once I knew that he understood it, and he knew when he was safe and who was nice to him and who he liked, once I knew that, it became a much different question for me to just think about how can Charlie go out in the world. Later in his life, when we were interviewing people to come and work as his PCA, and we interviewed 4 or 5 guys one day. This was in Maryland, and I found out one of them had grown up in a big institution in Nebraska, and because his father and mother were administrators there. And I said, well, Zach, you can't possibly come and work for Charlie because our values are completely different. And so I told the people running the organization, you know, any of these guys would be fine, but not that one, because I don't think he has the same values. And they said, no, 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 no. That's the one Charlie picked. I said, what do you mean, the one Charlie picked? Charlie doesn't talk. I'm the mother, I'm the decision maker. Charlie was maybe 16 years old at the time. And they said, Sue, are you blind or what? Did you not see? Charlie just rolls his chair over to the one that he wants and pats him on the arm. And they said, that's what he does every time. He did that the last time we interviewed somebody. Rolls his chair over, pats the person on the arm, and that means I want this one. So we hired Zach, and Zach turned out to be probably the second best attendant that Charlie ever had more sense of interacting with Charlie and not taking any crap from him. And sorry, I'm a Fed, I'm not supposed to say crap. Zach became his friend. When Zach married and had children of his own, Charlie was part of that, and they would come and take Charlie out to breakfast sometimes. And what does that mean? That's something that Charlie saw in him that day that I couldn't see. And when you think about that, and how do we construct systems that allow the person with the disability not just to be included by us in a charitable way, but to include themselves, to bring their own judgment to the process. And when you're going to build an inclusive school, it's not just the children with disabilities who need to be included. It's all of the other children. It's the parents. It's the teachers. Teachers often are stuffing their own ideas and judgments down, and if you have an inclusive setting, maybe they'll bring it up and come out. So when Charlie graduated from high school, this was at Walt Whitman High School in Maryland, where I think something like 80% of the teachers had PhDs. When we got there, coming from Minnesota, we didn't have a attendant for Charlie at the school, so my husband volunteered until they could get somebody hired. And I told Bill, now be sure you tell him you have a PhD and your name is Dr. Swenson. So, you know, they'd go to the IEP meetings and it would be doctor, doctor, doctor. Bill went to class, and we had Charlie in an AP history class at that time, and they called an IEP meeting, Bill did, and he said, you know, I don't think Charlie should be in this history class. And they were like, oh, Dr. Swenson, we totally agree with you. We think it's way over his head and much too difficult for him to be in the class. And Bill said, no, no, you don't understand. I don't think anybody should be in that history class. I mean, this was a history class where a guy just sat there and lectured at the kids for an hour, and then that was the end. And the rest of the kids were just, right? Charlie was in a theater class at one point, and the teacher called me up and said, you know, this isn't going to work. He's moaning all the time. And I said, yeah, he moans when he's bored. And the teacher went away, and he called me back a couple of weeks later, and he said, hey, you know what I figured out? And I said, no, what? And he said, they were all bored. So when you include a kid with a disability, how much life do you put into a class? How much change, how much new idea, how much chance do you have to actually have education be a human interaction for all of the children? It's an important topic to think about, I think, and one which our federal system is not designed to create. You know, I know you know, we do not have a national system of education. I've heard various secretaries of education complain about this bitterly. You know, how can you compare us to Singapore? They get to design their own curricula and we don't have a national. We have 18,000 school districts, 100,000 school buildings with their own leadership in the United States. How are we going to change something as fundamental as whether children with disabilities are allowed to walk in the door? Well, I think one way you change it is you don't make that child with a disability get a contract with the school system called an IEP before they're allowed to walk in the door. What other child needs a contract to walk in the door? Are there any? And it is a contract. It's signed by both, and it ends, you start the IEP process with a very old-fashioned notion of assessment, and most families I know think that their diagnosis is the basis of the educational assessment. I mean, I can't tell you how many families over the years when I was at ADD would call me and say, my child has blah-bitty-blah-bitty-blah syndrome. What would be a good IEP for them? You know, well, what do they like to do? What turns them on? What flips their switch? What are their skills? What do they want to do? It doesn't matter what syndrome they have. You don't design IEPs around syndrome. So when I was at Chicago, I don't know what time it is. Okay. I studied in college with a man named Richard McKeon. If any of you have read The Modern Library Aristotle, that's his edition, and it still is. McKeon was a powerhouse at Chicago. He worked for Eleanor Roosevelt in helping to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He did a survey of philosophers from every major nation and culture in the world to try to discover what were the commonalities in their approaches to human rights. He also designed a bunch of little interdisciplinary committees, and the committee that I was in was one of those. But he taught about 4 universal methods. That everything we do, there are 4 methods that are universal in every activity. One is the logistic, where you look at what he called the program and you look for errors in the program. 2 is problematic, where you look at the institutions of society and how a person might have difficulties interacting with various institutions. And that's what we would normally call the Aristotelian or the scientific method, where you identify a problem and then you research solutions for it. The 3rd is the operational, where you start out by saying, here's what we're trying to achieve, line up behind me. It's political, you're more focused on what you think, looking from the inside, so Descartes would be operational. And the last is dialectic, where you're looking for paradoxes and you're looking to get at the fundamental nature of the world, and you do that by trying to sort of move back and forth between different ways. Well, so I've applied these to disability. I think there are 4 methods that families use, and I think there are 4 methods that our nation has used to address disability. And someday I'm going to write this. I haven't quite gotten there yet, but I'm working on it. The first method is what, and I know I know the medical social distinction. I'm not talking about that. First, I'm not quite sure anybody really knows what a paradigm is. I think there's all kinds of disagreement about how do you define paradigm, and so I don't like the notion of a medical model and a social model. I would much rather talk about methods that we use. I think the first method that we use is a medical method, and that is a method where we diagnose and treat, right? So the doctor can diagnose the child, and frankly, there's a medical principle that says don't diagnose what you can't treat, which we seem to have completely forgotten now. We have people who are diagnosed with a whole raft of different syndromes, and there's no treatment for any of them. But anyway, you start and IDEA is like this. You start with an assessment, and then you develop therapies. And it's all designed to make the problem, whatever the flaw is, the error with the person, go away. So there are parents who come to school expecting that that's what special ed will do. Can you give therapy to my child so they won't have autism anymore? How many schools are up to their eyeballs in those requests? And there is no limit to what you can ask for if you're trying to make some kid's disability go away, right? Now, if you look at our nation, the first funding in disability was all at the NIH. It was all medically focused. And it turned into this raft of diagnoses that we have. But the next step is what I would call a rehab method. And the next piece of the law was the Rehab Act. So when you are using a rehab method, you're saying, what are the institutions of society that the person with a disability is interacting with, and how can I provide accommodations to them so that they can interact? So a wheelchair so that you can have mobility, or whatever else it is. You're not fixing the disability. It's not going to go away. You're accommodating it. But you're accommodating the person to interact with society. So in a way, when you're running a government program, it's how can we accommodate you to do what society wants you to do? Society wants you to eat with a spoon and tie your own shoes and bathe every day and have a job and all this other stuff. But there's a natural challenge that comes out of that, and I think that's where the ADA came from. And the rights method is what I would call the ADA method, which says not how do we accommodate you to do what society wants you to do, but what is it you want to do, and how do we make sure that you have access to that, whatever that is. So we need to have no public barriers. We need to have universal design, and you don't need to go to school and say, well, society wants me to learn, I don't know, how to live in a sheltered workshop. Instead, you're going to school and saying, I don't want to be in a sheltered workshop. I want to have a job. I want to have a job at Syracuse in the basketball program. I'd like to be handing out stuff. And kids just make this stuff up. It's what they want to do. But so we had the NIH funding, then the Rehab Act funding, and IDEA was part of that. This was the whole 1975 piece, was the rehab focus. And I think there was a tension between a medical and a rehab focus, then the rights focus, and last, the social focus. And I think this is rampant in government, at least in the Obama administration, and should be. And I think it's probably becoming more of a key topic in society in general. And that is, how do we make sure, from society's point of view, that we are equitably distributing the goods and services and supports to everyone in our society so that they have the health care that they need and they have the accommodations that they need to be productive or to participate, and they know what their rights are. They don't just have the rights, they know they have the rights. There's two different steps there. One, somebody else can say, oh, you have the right to this, that, and the other thing, but if you don't know it, it doesn't do you any good. So you almost need training to understand what your rights are. I think there's enough in there to think about what we could be doing with IDEA and how we could be reimagining how we interact with families of very young children and how we talk to them about disability and how we structure what goes into the rights that they have in school. Now, when I say we got to do something about due process, I am not naive enough to know that could be perceived as trampling on rights and has to be carefully thought through. I just submit to you, I look around the room and there's a lot of women in this room. If EOC, we had to go to due process before we could get a job from an employer as a woman, we wouldn't, any of us, none of us would have jobs. We go to due process under EEOC when someone has mistreated us, when something has not gone well, right? So it's after something has failed that we engage our due process rights. I don't know if there's enough here to think about, but I think we have a little time for questions. And if you guys aren't too hot to ask questions, I would very much value knowing what you're worried about. If you don't have a question, then I have one standard question that I would like to ask you, which is something I learned from Sergeant Shriver, and it is, if you had a magic wand and you could change one thing, what would you change? It's a great question, by the way.
Press the button on the bottom right so it flashes red before you speak, and after you speak, just turn it off, please, so we can hear the next person. Questions, magic wand, questions. Dean, can you grab a microphone in front of you? There, thanks. Thanks, Megan.
Dean Kloss, I'm a second-year PhD student in the education department. A lot of the concepts and ideas you're talking about are very admirable, and they're very noble. But still, Rowley is still the law of the land.
Yep.
And K-12 education, some educational benefit in the time of all the testing involved in NCLB and standards-based education and the ESSA, it seems to be an anachronism. So I think on the one hand, for those of us who are involved in K-12 education, we hear a lot of great ideas, but when the rubber meets the road, it seems like the standard that some districts are held to is so low that there seems to be a great disparity between those two. So could you address that?
There is. And we had guidance this year that says if you're going to have FAPE for a kid with a disability, their IEP has to be linked to the general education curriculum. I think there's a lot of cultural change that needs to happen. And so when I was on the Hill for a year as a Kennedy Fellow, I worked for Bill Frist, who was a Republican, because I was working for the majority. And they would always say, that government is best which governs least. And I don't think they understood the grounding of that statement. That statement doesn't mean that license is better for society. That statement means that if people truly are free, if they're free of avarice and greed and misanthropy and all of the other flaws, then we don't have to govern them very much because they're going to be decent to each other and kind to each other. And I think we're expecting a lot of law and regulation when it comes to disability and special education. I think what people think about disability is almost the centerpiece of cultures around the world. There are taboos and beliefs and understandings in disability and related to disability that have to be challenged and understood if we're going to, as Jefferson said, be enlightened and develop new models and new ways of thinking about things. And I think we're up against that. I think, we've got due process, but all that can do is uphold current law. That's the limit. And what we really need to do is go beyond compliance. We need to think about, so when I was training parents, I used to say, you go into a restaurant and you order lunch, right? The waiter comes to your table and says, oh, we have all these wonderful things. What would you like to have for lunch? And you say, I don't care, but it better not have any bugs in it. And that's compliance level thinking. When you're demanding compliance with IDEA as a parent of a child with a disability, you're demanding the least that the law would allow to be done for your child. And yet, we don't empower or work with parents or educators to try to build communities that can think beyond that. And schools think that they have to stick to the IEP and to the IDEA. And they don't understand that as long as you're not getting in trouble, you shouldn't have to do everything the way IDEA says. So I think you're right. I just think it's a culture. We have to shift culture, and it keeps getting jammed. We keep bringing in, like, all of a sudden everybody has autism. And everybody thinks it's new. Everybody thinks we've never seen people with autism before. And they don't notice that as the numbers of children with autism have increased in American schools, the numbers of children identified with intellectual disability have decreased in American schools. And they don't notice that the waiver systems that were designed to serve people with developmental disabilities will serve people with autism if their disability reaches that severity test. So, but that the fact that there was a, quote, new diagnosis led parents to believe, again, push them all back into the medical model. Where's the therapy? Where's the medicine? Where's the cure for this new disease that my child has? And people don't culturally understand how this stuff all fits together. So I don't know if that's not an answer, but it's a rambling. Yeah.
Sorry. The thing that bothers me about the due process approach that we use right now is that I think it privileges middle-class white parents who have the ability to advocate. And so, and it doesn't create class action kind of changes. It just changes things one kid at a time.
Right.
And so it often doesn't change the situation for kids of color or kids that come from families that don't have the wherewithal to sort of work the system.
Which is more and more and more families.
Right.
Now.
So I'm wondering about alternatives that would, or how we address that inequity in some different way that you're thinking about. Thank you.
So I am thinking about this a lot, and it's not a proposal, it's just an idea, so it's kind of raw. But we have 504, and more kids are choosing 504. So there are now almost 1 million children who are being educated under 504 in our schools.
I just saw, though, a talk where a person was in an urban school and only white kids had 504 plans. So white parents are able to leverage that 504.
Figure out what it is, right. Well, and then if you have any learning need, you have to go into IDEA. So what I was thinking was, in a modern world where we have modern technology and modern accommodations for learning, and they're generic, why couldn't we have a third way that says, if you use technology to accommodate yourself in a learning environment or a testing environment, as long as you're in the general education curriculum and environment, you will not have to have an IEP. So I think people are going to 504 because they avoid the placement risk. I mean, every family of color that I ever worked with in Minneapolis was afraid to do the assessment on the front end because they didn't want the segregation that came on the back end. And I think we have to think more deeply about that. I don't know that we can really change IDEA. I think it might be a political third rail, but maybe we can create new things. And the number of kids in IDEA is decreasing too, as 504 is increasing. So, but kids of color, I don't know if you guys saw, we had a map that we put out recently. It took me 2 years to get this thing done. But it's on our website. It's actually on the NCES website. If you Google NCES OSS for out of school suspension, there's a map of every school district in the United States with rates of out of school suspensions and expulsions crossed by IEP participation, by gender, and by race. And if you click on a school district, their statistics show up. So you can compare the local school district to one next door or to others that are comparable. This obviously fits in my social method, and it's something we have to think about. What kind of nation do we want to live in? Do we want to live in a nation where children are allowed to be ignored and pushed under the bus simply because their parents are working 2 jobs and can't come to a meeting? It's important. It's very important.
So thank you very much. And my question is basically, why isn't every child individually assessed every year? regardless of disability or not in that category. So my understanding of education is much of it was based on an industrial system that's simply no longer applicable, right? To get people prepared for manufacturing jobs. In the knowledge economy, absolutely, we understand that there's going to have to be a lot more individuation generally in education. And if you really want universal design, why isn't every child assessed? And that, of course, would take away a lot of these problems.
We have one of our largest grants that we made in the Obama administration is the SWIFT program, School-Wide Inclusion for Transformation, or something like that it stands for. And it is, what we're doing is allowing schools to ignore the rules of IDEA and Title I and the ESL programs, and instead we're teaching the schools how to use data and talk to each other about the needs of all children in their school and how those resources can be braided together. What we discovered is that poor schools, when they were given money, would just buy a whole bunch of computers and put them in the closet. They didn't know what to do when they did get resources. So, and one of the goals of this program is individual assessment for each child and individualizing education for each child. So, and they have parents. I mean, you can't sign away your rights under IDEA because it's a civil rights law, and you can't just say, okay, never mind. But they do have parents who say, I don't need to have an IEP this year. I'll participate in this group decision making around the data for all of the children.
I'm simply saying, because even here at university, we're constantly people come forward with new disabilities, something they haven't discovered before. I mean, there's an incredible loss to society where this has to come from an individual person's home to seek out aid, as opposed to it being a standardized inquiry of care consistently throughout the education system.
Yep.
And that could be something the federal government actually could do, which is require a mandate, right, across the systems.
Congress could do that.
Yeah, that's right.
Good luck with that.
Well, I mean, if we only want to talk about
Vote.
political
Just
reality,
be sure you vote.
reality, I'm just saying, if you only want to talk about political realities, then we're never going to get anywhere in disability rights advocacy.
Well, write a proposal and give it to your congressman. You'd be surprised how effective that is.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm a graduating master's student from the School of Education, and we're so happy to have you here. And I'm glad that I have this opportunity to ask you how you feel about an area that's very concerning to me. And I've been working with Arlene on this, writing a paper for her this semester about disabled children in homeschool in states like North Carolina or Kentucky, and in which federal disability rights don't always extend to them because the constitutions in those states are only about public school and disability. And with homeschool, there does not seem to be any oversight whatsoever. As a person with deafness and other disabilities, I look at cases in which children receive no accommodations that have deafness and other disabilities. And I would just like to know if you have thoughts on maybe how that could be addressed in order to expand rights under the ADA and maybe other legislation to all children.
Wow. See, I told you, questions stump the Fed. I wish I had an answer to that. I think it's a really fundamental question. I think that there are families pushed into homeschooling by districts that are saying, we can't meet your child's needs, you could do this better at home. You know, we'll send you a tutor once a week or something. There are also families who are homeschooling because of belief systems that they have. And sometimes those belief systems include old-fashioned notions of culture and what's at the heart of disability, what it means. I mean, I have had some amazingly oddball things said to me by people who had a very strong religious belief system about disability and its role in my life. And there are people who homeschool because one of the parents is a skilled educator and they can build a wonderful program that makes sense for them. And you may know that the Homeschool Legal Defense Association is the organization that stopped the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities from going forward. You may not know that they also were the single organization that testified against the Convention on the Rights of the Child and the Convention to eliminate all forms of discrimination against women. So this one little organization turned out to be the centerpiece of all of the human rights treaties that the United States has backed away from in recent years. There's something there. There's something really important there. I've looked up some of the numbers on homeschooling, and we have in the United States now about 2.5 million kids who are homeschooled. That's a lot. We have about 6.5 million who are in IDEA and about 1 million in 504. So having 2.5 million in homeschooling is a lot. And in a lot of countries, you can't do it unless you have a license. You can't just say, I make a decision to homeschool my child. So we sort of stand out like a sore thumb in the nations of the world. And I think it really is important. I don't know that we have data. I don't know that anybody has ever put together the data that would help us as the Department of Education say, we now see that these children are not graduate. I mean, in some countries, Denmark, you can homeschool your child, but they have to take an annual written and oral exam on the whole curriculum for the year. And if they don't pass, then you can't keep homeschooling. Well, what if we had that here, right? I think it's a serious issue. I think it's right at the heart, though, of the people who are standing against progressive human rights ideals in the United States. So difficult, really difficult.
Thank you.
Yep.
Sorry. I hope I can figure out exactly how to ask this. It seems to me there's a big tension between IDEA and No Child Left Behind, or between standardized testing, the standards movement, and the idea of inclusion. That these tests, the 3 to 8 tests that Race to the Top really pushed, are not accessible for many children who have learning disabilities. And I wonder if there's been any discussion of that at the education department.
So, can I take the fifth? No. Difficult question. We hope that the new regs for ESSA will be giving us quite a bit more progress on these issues. And I can't really talk about that. The 1% rule is really important. We think it's important for children to at least have that anchor of a test at some point, and if we're not meeting their educational needs, we need to have a test that shows that. Personally, I think we haven't yet exhausted the possibilities of technology and how that is or isn't helping children. My key issue is that there are some states that will allow children to use accommodating technology in a learning environment, but not in a testing environment. And we're working with people like Princeton Testing Service and others to try to ameliorate that. Part of that is driven by the world community. The OECD doesn't allow electronic accommodations on its key exams, like the PIAC, which is a test of workers and how well they use technology. And I keep going to those meetings and saying, if that's what we're testing, then why aren't we letting them use accommodating technology? I think we still have a terrible misunderstanding generally in our culture about what accommodations are and what they mean.
I guess the other way that I find that the tests are not accessible, I really only know about New York's tests, is for a 5th grader to be taking a test that's set up like an AP exam, where these nuances of meaning, it's not really accessible for many children. And so rather than finding out what kids really know, we're figuring out whether they know how to take these tests.
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I don't know New York. I know you have a very highly specialized system of testing, but in a lot of the stuff that I think No Child Left Behind, as much as I didn't like that, I called it No Child's Behind Left. I think it carried a lot of freight for decisions that were actually made at a state and local level, and they were blaming, oh, the feds are making us do this. That's always the best excuse, and sometimes the feds are nowhere near making anybody do anything. So this is a challenge. It's something where when you talk to other countries, most other countries that are doing the PISA exam do not have universal right to education. So children with very significant disabilities are not ever part of their testing cohort. And even advanced countries don't necessarily allow children with my son's level of disability to go to a public school. So, we're comparing ourselves apples to oranges to something else. But the thing is, I think there's a trade-off. I think when we do inclusive education in American schools, it becomes an engine of democracy. And I've heard, for example, the chief of schools in Singapore say, yeah, my kids can listen to lectures and read stuff and memorize it and spit it back on a test, and they can do that really well. And they always come out on top or near the top of the PISA exams. He said, but I would give anything if they could solve problems the way American children can solve problems. Think about things together, collaborate on issues and problems. And that, I think, is something that is really supported, at least in my experience, by inclusion in school. When I talk to international education visitors, I always tell them, hey, if you don't want democracy in your country, whatever you do, don't do inclusive education, because it is child-centered. It forces an educational system to focus on the individual child and children in general, and that's where the democratic impulse comes from. Tocqueville said at the end of Democracy in America that the future of the democracy in our country depends on the education of women, because they are the ones who will teach children to question authority. And that's what he saw in the early 19th century. So I think this is all of a piece. I think inclusive education teaches children to question authority too. So, important question, keep asking it.
Hi, yes, I'm Bruce. I guess if I had a magic wand, as a person with a disability, I was in an inclusive environment from kindergarten to high school. However, I didn't learn Braille. They told me that the IEP team forced print on me and told my parents that it was the best thing for me to maximize my vision, what limited it was. And while I may have taught people about disability, I found that I was mostly ignored and excluded, even though I was in an inclusive environment. And so if I had a magic wand, I guess one of the things I would do is to create a curriculum that included in the discussion, in the discourse, disability in the curriculum from K to 12, so that not only would the disabled student feel like they were learning about themselves and their own history, but also that non-disabled people could grow up to be law professors and lawyers and whatever Fed or whoever they might grow up to be, knowing a little bit about disability in a deeper way.
Yep.
The other thing that I would do if I had a magic wand is
I didn't give you two wishes, but that's okay in this
I get
case.
two because I'm disabled. I'm cutting in front of the line. The other one was once we are prepared to go or semi-prepared to go to higher education, I would wish that the academy would be ready for us and for us to be able to meet the expectations of the professors, the institution, so that instead of the disability services, the first thing they say at Berkeley or at Syracuse, who claim to have the greatest disability programs in the country, both of which I've attended now, saying that, maybe you ought to think about one of the first things they say at the disability services is maybe you ought to think about taking less or fewer units. Maybe you ought to think about that. Well, I tell them, well, maybe you ought to think about, what I should tell them, I guess, ideally is maybe you ought to think about how to make it so that the tools are available so that I can meet the expectations of the professors in a law environment or whatever environment that is. And so, thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. I appreciate that. And there is some effort. California requires disability rights to be taught in school curricula right along with other civil rights movements, but I think California is the only state that has that requirement. Maybe somebody should write those curricula for kids at various ages and what we should be teaching kids about disability. I think that's a great idea. Yeah, no kidding. Because otherwise, you're kind of out to lunch. Yeah.
So my question actually kind of goes off my friend here, and it's I've been reading some research on the opt-out, the people that are opting out of the tests, and how disproportionately those are students with disabilities that are being encouraged or provided with forms to opt out of our testing environments as a way for some districts to get around the 1% rule. And I'm just wondering, do you know of anyone that's tracking that on a federal level? Are we watching that as a way that we're getting out of the accountability of making sure that these students are receiving as little as mandated currently, right? Some educational benefit.
So I don't think we are tracking it. I don't know how we would, but I think we are very aware of it and following it. I recently read an essay, and I can't remember where, but it was fascinating, drawing a connection between opting out and anti-vax. So the personality type that says, oh, this is all a giant conspiracy against my child, and I'm not going to do what the system tells me to do, is actually, it's a commonality between people who are opting out and people who are opposing vaccinations for children. Opting out it's a sort of the same problem, because the reason you have tests is to see if you need to make adjustments in how you're approaching the whole population of children. It's a public education question, just like vaccination is a public health question. So I don't know, maybe you try Googling those two things together, and if you'll see the article is as interesting as I thought it was. I used to say, I wished you would just test Charlie, because you don't know what he might be learning, and if you can find some way to test him, God bless, just do it. And if he gets a 0, he won't care. He just didn't care.
Yeah.
So I personally don't find any strong argument behind opting out, but I know there's a lot of buzz about it, and there are people who are leaders of it, and there are people who are frankly making a ton of money out of making speeches about opting out. So,
are we tracking the students that are opting out in general?
And what happens to them?
Or not even just that. Like, do we know that there's 87? Is the government checking that there's 87 students from that school that's opted out? Because that should be fairly easy to correlate, right, with which students are also enrolled in special ed.
So again, the government isn't tracking anything that Congress didn't tell us to track.
Fair.
So this goes back to the federal government being a flower of civilization. We can't just sit around and say, oh, by the way. Now, we could have a grant. Someone could make a grant application and say, I want to do a study of this. And that might be really interesting. Then there might be more information there than I know of. I am sue.swenson@ed.gov. If you want to send me a question, I will try to get you an answer. It might take me a couple days to get back
That
to
might
you.
be a dangerous proposal, but I think you might be getting an email from me.
Okay, that's fine. Anybody who wants to. I mean, I work for you, so well or badly. I'm not an educator, that's obvious. I'm not a lawyer. That's obvious. But I do happen to be a Fed. Darren.
Yes, Sue, thank you. Thanks for coming. I was thinking as you were talking about, do you think that there's a possibility that through the evolution of education and special education and all of this, that we could actually get to a place where all children could come to a classroom and to a school, and it wouldn't have to be special education because it would be universal design for everyone, and special education wouldn't exist anymore? I guess where I'm going with that is the big term used to be mainstream, right? We were mainstreaming. Well, we've kind of switched that to full inclusion now. But full inclusion says I'm being included in something, from my perspective, that I don't belong. So you have to fully include me so that I can be a part of whatever your something is. And what I've been asking in my classes here is, why can't we just get to the place where our kids are on equal footing? And by the way, I have 2 kids with developmental disabilities, so that's what I mean by our kids.
So I think that is the goal, Darren, and I think it's I think most people who are functioning at the leading edges would say that that is the goal, to make sure that we have universal design for learning, to make sure that teachers have the skills that they need, to make sure that schools have the resources they need to be able to support that kind of learning. You run into problems when you start talking to the deaf community about that kind of education, because we're at a nexus, we're at a place where if you want to learn ASL, you have to be with other kids who learn ASL. And are we going to be able, as a culture, to educate all children to be able to use ASL? These are, and the deaf community is under other kinds of what are perceived as assaults with cochlear implants and other kinds of processes. So I think there's a lot to figure out about who belongs together. I think everybody belongs together, but I'm not the mother of a deaf child. And I'm not a person who experiences deafness or blindness. And being able to learn Braille is a key skill, and many of the schools for the blind will tell you nobody can do that as well as we can do it. I think new technology with refreshable Braille on what looks like an iPad could change a lot of things pretty quickly, and new technologies for people who have other kinds of disabilities could change things pretty quickly. And our growing commitment to labeling children as having emotional disorders is a real problem with all of this. And I don't think we have quite yet mastered the trauma that we're inflicting on children who might start with a little behavior problem, and by the time we're done, they're in a full explosive disorder. So I worry that our schools are actually inflicting trauma on children. And these are children who already experience trauma in their life or have experienced trauma. So I think we have a lot to learn, but I think that's the goal, and we have to try to get there. Yeah.
And then maybe we'll take one more and give Sue a chance to rest here.
I want to get down lower where it's cooler.
Okay, yeah, here.
It's really hot up here.
We're here at Syracuse University, and many of us came here because of some of the leaders in the field of disability who are now either gone or retired. And Doug Bicklin, one of our mentors and many of us, talked often about the presumption of competency. And I don't want you to do another whole lecture, but I just want to take us to a different place, which is that many teachers, I've learned from students I've had, are encouraged to talk to parents in the transition planning process to plan to have guardians appointed for their young adults once they reach the age of majority. And here at the law school, together with students from the School of Ed, we've been doing research on this issue, talking to people who don't have guardians so they can tell their stories about how they make decisions. And I think it's been a really illuminating project for all of us who've been involved. And I guess what I want to pose is there any conversation within the department or for you personally of how to move us away from this effort all through K through 12 to help kids become more independent, reach their potentials, be assimilated, socially develop, and then, okay, you're going to graduate high school, and then someone will be appointed to make all your decisions, so you didn't even get a chance to learn how to ask for help in making decisions. And to me, I know that this has kind of become, I know my students here, they've heard me, but anyway, a little bit of a passion for me, because I think it's the intersection of law and education that needs to change. And I was just wondering about your reflections.
So we published a resource guide when I was acting assistant secretary for a few months last year. And the resource guide is about age of majority for parents of children with disabilities. And it encourages looking at supported decision-making and alternatives to guardianship. We have tried to make it clear to teachers, and I don't think we're the right people to do this, but somebody has to make it clear to teachers that they shouldn't be practicing law. They shouldn't be making recommendations about the legal status of one of their students. But again, I think parents come to them with an expectation that they'll tell you, what do I need when my kid transitions out of school? And teachers don't necessarily know what they might need or what. So they want to say the most protective thing because they want to make sure nobody's ever going to get in trouble. Nobody's ever going to get hurt. The other thing is, and I know this is countercultural, but I don't think we educate guardians very well. Most people think that guardianship means you just get a plenary, the person is your chattel. You now get to just make all the decisions for them. And they don't understand the responsibility of most integrated setting, the responsibility of returning legal capacity to their ward. They're not really given clear notion of what it means. If you do have to be a guardian, it is possible. I have a friend who's a law professor who's guardian for his sister. And he said, look, it's possible to practice guardianship as a form of supported decision making. But it has to be the commitment of the guardian to make that happen. I want to tell you one more story. So my Charlie, when I was CEO at the ARC, I went to the Disability Caucus at the UN when they were drafting the CRPD. And I kept raising my hand to be called on. And these two women who were running the meeting, one had chronic pain and the other one was a psychiatric survivor. They refused to call on me. So I got ticked off and I went up to them after the meeting and said, what's the deal? I'm raising my hand. I want to contribute. You won't call on me. And they said, yeah, we know all about you. You're just a parent. I said, okay. This is a room full of hundreds of disability advocates from around the world. If you can imagine the people that Ecuador would send to the UN to work on the CRPD, these were geniuses in wheelchairs is what these were. I got mad. They said, if you want your son's voice to be heard, I said, my son doesn't speak, so it's either me or nothing. They said, if you want his voice to be heard, you have to bring him here, and he has to tell his own story. And I said, well, that would be a miracle. He doesn't speak. But then I got mad, and I went home, and I thought about it, and I thought, you know what? Who else is going to bring a non-speaking adult to testify at the Disability Caucus at the UN? New York is a very expensive city. Who's going to fly in from Malawi with their kid to do this testimony? So I said yes. And the next caucus, I was on a panel with my son Will, who was working in New York at the time, my son Charlie, Zach, the guy I was telling you about before who grew up in an institution, and me. And I was already mad when I went into the room, so I was primed. Went into the room, on the panel, I looked at all of the people in the room, and I said, so you guys are all geniuses in wheelchairs, and you've written this law. At that time, the legal capacity provision was no one will have support. No one will ever have a guardian or support. Everyone makes their own decision, period. That's what it said. So if you leave it this way, you might as well call this the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Minor Inconveniences. Because if you're intellectually intact and communicatively intact, the notion that somehow you need to sacrifice people who have different disabilities or other disabilities so that you can protect your own authority, it's just grotesque. Anyway, I told them the story of why I was there and why I was invited and that Charlie was going to speak for himself. I said, you invited me here so Charlie could speak for himself, and Charlie, what do you have to say for yourself? And I just stood back. And you guys, this was the longest 2 minutes of my life because I had to stand back. And Charlie doesn't speak, and I knew he wasn't going to speak. And yet that was the only doorway they gave me. And at the end of that, I then asked Zach and Will to talk about the responsibilities of being a caregiver and a sibling of a man with disabilities and what they wanted. And what they said was, we want to support each other and support Charlie in his decision making. We want to be able to challenge each other. We want there to be a team. We want to be able, they described a process that was very true, that if we made decisions and Zach thought it was stupid, he would say, Sue, Charlie wouldn't like that, that's stupid. And it was all part of the decision-making process, was we supported each other to do that. And we all talked about that, and then I stood back and said, you know, you told me that if Charlie came here, he would speak for himself, and I thought you were completely out to lunch, and you just didn't understand severe disability. But I think Charlie just did speak for himself. And I think you're going to have to, A, write some language about families and their role in the CRPD, and B, write some language about supported decision-making and what it means and what it's going to go forward. So I take ownership for the little paragraph in the preamble about families and their role, and I give Charlie ownership of the language on supported decision-making, because they did, God bless them, every genius in a wheelchair in the room, every blind genius, every deaf genius, they'd heard him. They understood him in ways that I deeply respect. And so I think supported decision-making is what it's all about. And I think it starts when your kids are really little. And it starts for all of us when our kids are really little. And we have to start showing, if we have a disabled child, we have to show our non-disabled children how we support decisions. And we have to be able to say to a teacher, oh, he's bored, instead of, oh, he's moaning because he's disabled, you know? There are decisions that people with severe disabilities display to us every day, and we're not listening, we're not paying attention. So, and presuming competence is a big part of that. So, thank you.